January 17th, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. The winter light filtered pale and cold through the high windows of the Palace of Justice, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. In the courtroom, the air hung thick with the weight of testimony, cigarette smoke, and the shuffle of translated pages. A man sat in the witness box, ramrod straight in posture, yet visibly diminished. His uniform had been replaced by a grey suit that hung loose on his frame. His hands, once accustomed to signing orders that moved battalions, now trembled slightly as they gripped the wooden rail before him. The tribunal judges sat elevated, their faces impassive masks of jurisprudence. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward, pencils poised. The world was listening. And on this cold January morning, former SS-Obersturmbannführer Klaus Weber began to speak about things the Third Reich had never intended the world to hear. The confession that emerged that day was not born of remorse in the traditional sense, but of something perhaps more unsettling, a clinical detachment, a bureaucratic recounting of systematic cruelty, as though it were merely administrative procedure. Weber had commanded a detention facility in occupied Poland from 1942 to 1944, a place that existed in the shadowy margins between prisoner of war camp and concentration camp, where captured resistance fighters, political prisoners and civilians suspected of aiding partisans were held. Among them were women, hundreds of women, whose treatment Weber now described with the same methodical precision he had once applied to its execution. The machinery of the Third Reich had been vast and complex, a bureaucratic organism that consumed nations and spat out ash. Within that machinery, certain facilities operated with particular purposes, and certain commanders were selected for their capacity to implement policies that required a specific temperament. Weber had been such a selection. His personnel file, introduced as evidence, noted his reliability in matters requiring discretion, and his understanding of psychological operations. What these euphemisms concealed was now being laid bare in testimony that would span 3 days and fill hundreds of pages of trial transcripts. The systematic harassment Weber described was not the random brutality of undisciplined soldiers, though such brutality certainly occurred. Rather, it was policy, codified, taught, and implemented with the efficiency the Reich applied to all its horrors. Female prisoners were subjected to a calculated regime of humiliation, designed to break not just bodies, but identities, to strip away dignity as methodically as their possessions had been catalogued and confiscated upon arrival. Weber spoke of mandatory public strip searches conducted not for security, but for psychological degradation. He described the deliberate assignment of female prisoners to humiliating labour, cleaning officers' quarters in states of undress, performing physically impossible tasks while male guards observed and commented, work details structured specifically to maximise vulnerability and shame. The testimony revealed a system where harassment was weaponized, where the threat of sexual violence hung constant and deliberate over the facility like a second barbed wire fence. Weber detailed how female prisoners were housed in barracks positioned deliberately adjacent to guard quarters, how inspections were conducted at arbitrary hours designed to deny sleep and create perpetual anxiety, how guards were tacitly encouraged, sometimes explicitly ordered, to make crude remarks, to invade privacy, to create an atmosphere of constant sexual menace without necessarily enacting rape itself, though Weber acknowledged such assaults occurred and went unpunished. What made the testimony particularly chilling was Weber's description of the rationale. This was not presented to his guards as mere license for cruelty, but as a tool of state security. Female prisoners were predominantly family members of resistance fighters, or suspected partisans themselves, or women who had provided food or shelter to Jews or escaped prisoners. The systematic harassment, Weber explained with grotesque logic, served multiple purposes. It punished those who defied Reich authority. It provided an example to deter others in occupied territories. It extracted information through the erosion of psychological resistance. And, most cynically, it efficiently destroyed the will to continue resistance without expending the bullets that might be needed at the front. The historical record shows that Weber's facility was not unique. As Allied forces advanced through Europe in 1944 and 1945, they liberated dozens of such installations, finding women in states of severe psychological and physical trauma. Red Cross reports from the period document patterns of abuse consistent across multiple facilities. the deliberate sleep deprivation, the forced nudity, the sexualized humiliation disguised as administrative procedure. Soviet forces advancing from the east encountered similar evidence. The scope of the systematic harassment Weber confessed to was merely one node in a network of institutionalized cruelty that spanned the occupied territories. In the courtroom, as Weber continued his testimony, something unexpected occurred among the observers. The journalists, initially writing with furious speed, began to slow. Some stopped entirely, unable to maintain the professional detachment their craft demanded. In the gallery, a woman, a survivor who had travelled from Poland to witness the trials, stood abruptly and left, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that followed a particularly graphic detail. The judges called a brief recess. When proceedings resumed, Weber's attorney attempted to contextualize the testimony, to frame it within the chaos of war, the pressures of occupation, the brutality of partisan warfare that killed German soldiers. The tribunal's chief prosecutor, a British barrister named Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, responded with a question that cut through the obfuscation. Did these women, Commander Weber, sign the Geneva Convention? Did they declare war on Germany? Or were they simply unfortunate enough to exist in territory you occupied? Weber's answer was perhaps his most honest moment in 3 days of testimony. He said simply, "They existed where the Reich needed to demonstrate total control. The ideology that produced such a statement had been carefully constructed over more than a decade. The National Socialist state had predicated its entire existence on hierarchies of human value, on the categorization of people into the worthy and the disposable. Within this framework, occupied populations existed in a state of permanent subjugation, and women from such populations represented the lowest tier of that already degraded status. Nazi ideological training, which Weber had received at Bad Tölz SS officer school, explicitly taught that conquered peoples were not to be treated as equals, that the projection of German superiority required the systematic demonstration of others' inferiority, and that mercy was weakness in the existential struggle for racial dominance. Weber's facility was simply the logical endpoint of ideology meeting opportunity. But ideology alone does not create the individual who implements such policy. Weber's background, explored during the trial, revealed the formation of a particular kind of functionary. Born in Bavaria in 1908, educated in law, unemployed during the Depression, he joined the SS in 1933 not out of fervent ideological conviction, but seeking stability and purpose. His rise through ranks came not through combat valour, but through administrative competence, and a quality his superiors noted repeatedly: his ability to execute orders without questioning their moral dimension. He was not a sadist in the clinical sense. Psychological evaluations conducted by the Allies described him as emotionally constricted, over-identified with authority, and possessing what one psychiatrist termed a pathological capacity for compartmentalization. He could describe atrocities with the same effect he might use to discuss filing systems, because in his psychological architecture, both were simply tasks assigned by legitimate authority. The women who survived Weber's facility told different stories when their turns came to testify. They spoke of specific guards, specific incidents, but more than that, they described the cumulative psychological weight of existing in a space designed to remind them hourly of their vulnerability. A woman named Anna Kowalska, who had been imprisoned for 18 months after being denounced for hiding a Jewish child, described the constant calculation that governed every movement, whether to make eye contact with a guard or avoid it, whether to stand straight and risk being accused of insolence or to slouch and risk being accused of disrespect, whether to maintain silence or to respond to questions, knowing that either choice could trigger punishment. The harassment was not random. It was a maze with no exit, a system designed to ensure that any choice could be the wrong one. Another survivor, Maria Novak, testified about the erosion of identity that such treatment produced. She described how, after months of being referred to only by a number, of being forced to strip for inspection multiple times daily, of being assigned to clean officers' latrines while guards made graphic remarks about her body, she began to experience a dissociation from her own physical form, as though the woman being humiliated was someone else, a stranger she observed from a distance. This psychological fracture, she explained through tears, had persisted years after liberation. She still could not bear certain types of touch. She still felt phantom shame when undressing, even alone. The tribunal heard from medical professionals who examined survivors. They documented the physical manifestations of sustained psychological trauma, chronic insomnia, severe anxiety responses, what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then simply called nervous exhaustion. They described malnutrition exacerbated by the inability to eat under constant stress, stress-induced amenorrhea in women who had been subjected to routine forced examinations, and the premature aging effect of existing in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. Weber's defense attempted to minimize his personal culpability, arguing that he was following orders issued from higher authority, that the policies originated not with him, but with Reich Security Main Office directives, that he was a functionary within a vast system where refusal to implement policy would simply have resulted in his replacement by someone who would implement it more harshly. This defense had been deployed repeatedly at Nuremberg and would be deployed in subsequent trials. It represented a fundamental question about the nature of moral responsibility within hierarchical systems designed to diffuse culpability across multiple levels of command. But the prosecution presented evidence that complicated this narrative of passive implementation. They introduced Weber's own reports, filed monthly to his superiors, in which he described the effectiveness of various harassment techniques, recommended refinements to procedure, and even proposed innovations, his term, in psychological pressure methods. These documents revealed not a reluctant functionary, but an engaged participant, someone who approached the systematic degradation of human beings with the same problem-solving mentality he might apply to any administrative challenge. One report, dated August 1943, discussed the optimal timing of night inspections to maximize sleep disruption while maintaining sufficient prisoner functionality for labor assignments. Another, from November 1943, analyzed the comparative effectiveness of public versus private humiliation in extracting information from female prisoners suspected of resistance connections. The courtroom absorbed these details in a silence that felt dense and suffocating. This was not the testimony of a monster in the theatrical sense, not a raving fanatic or a sadistic psychopath. This was something perhaps more disturbing, an ordinary man of moderate intelligence and legal education who had committed extraordinary evil through the simple mechanism of viewing people as problems to be managed rather than as humans to be respected. The banality of his evil, though that precise phrase would not be coined for another 15 years, was evident in every page of his methodical reports, every clinical description of suffering inflicted. As the testimony continued into its second and third days, Weber described the facility's final months in late 1944 as Soviet forces approached from the east. Orders came from Berlin to destroy evidence and liquidate prisoners who might testify to conditions. Weber claimed he had resisted full implementation of these orders, that he had arranged transfers for some prisoners rather than executions, that he had deliberately delayed the destruction of records. His defense attorney presented this as evidence of conscience, a line Weber himself had refused to cross. The prosecution countered with survivor testimony that transfers to other camps were often death sentences by different means, and that Weber's preservation of certain records was likely motivated by self-protection. Documentary evidence he could use to claim cooperation with authorities if the Reich prevailed, or proof of restraint if the Allies won. The symbolic weight of Weber's testimony extended beyond his individual guilt. His confession represented an acknowledgement of something the Reich had attempted to conceal, not just from the world, but from its own population, that the occupation of Europe involved not merely military subjugation, but a deliberate project of psychological destruction aimed at conquered peoples. The systematic harassment of women was not incidental to this project, but central to it, a method of demonstrating total power, of breaking not just individual resistance, but the social cohesion of occupied communities by attacking the dignity of mothers, daughters, sisters, wives. In the courtroom, the symbolic object that recurred throughout testimony was not a weapon or a tool, but something more mundane, the clipboard. Multiple survivors mentioned it. The clipboard guards carried when conducting inspections, the clipboard Weber himself carried during facility tours, the clipboard that represented the bureaucratic apparatus transforming human suffering into administrative data. On that clipboard were forms documenting prisoner arrival, forms recording disciplinary actions, forms tracking interrogation sessions, forms quantifying the unquantifiable horror of human degradation. The clipboard symbolized the Reich's fundamental perversion, the application of modern administrative efficiency to ancient cruelty, the transformation of barbarism into procedure. Weber himself seemed unaware of this symbolic weight. When prosecutors questioned him about specific incidents recorded on facility forms, he would reference the clipboard, explaining which form documented which type of interaction, as though the existence of proper paperwork somehow legitimized the actions recorded. This reflexive, bureaucratic thinking persisted even as he confessed to systematic abuse. He had filled out the forms, he had followed the procedures. In his own fractured moral reasoning, this constituted evidence not of guilt but of correctness. The transformation that Weber's confession revealed was not his own. He showed little evidence of genuine moral awakening, only a pragmatic recognition that the regime he served had lost, and that cooperation with Allied justice might mitigate his punishment. Rather, the transformation was in the public consciousness of what occupation had meant. The Nuremberg trials were revealing layer upon layer of systematic cruelty, but the testimony about the treatment of women cut through abstractions, about military operations and political ideology, to something viscerally understandable. These were stories about daughters and mothers, about the weaponization of vulnerability, about a regime that had industrialized not just murder, but humiliation. The press coverage of Weber's testimony spread across a world still grappling with the full dimensions of Nazi horror. In America, newspapers ran excerpts alongside editorial commentary about the importance of documenting these crimes, not for revenge but for history, so that future generations might understand the depths to which ideology unchecked by conscience could sink. In Britain, the testimony reinforced public support for the trial process, even as some questioned whether legal proceedings could adequately address crimes of such magnitude. In the Soviet Union, where similar atrocities had been documented extensively on the Eastern Front, Weber's confession was presented as further evidence of fascism's inherent brutality. Among survivors, the reaction was complex. Some found validation in Weber's admission, official recognition of suffering that occupying authorities had dismissed as propaganda or lies. Others felt the inadequacy of legal language to capture experiential reality. How could testimony and cross-examination convey the lived experience of existing in a space where your body was not your own, where your dignity could be stripped away on a guard's whim, where you calculated hourly whether this moment might bring assault? Several survivors who attended the trial later wrote memoirs describing the strange dissociation of hearing their torment, discussed in legal abstractions, reduced to exhibit numbers and case precedents. Weber's actual confession, the moment he acknowledged systematic harassment as policy rather than isolated incidents, came on the second day of testimony under prosecutorial pressure. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe had led him through hours of questioning about specific women, specific incidents, specific dates, building an overwhelming record of pattern and practice. Then came the question, "Commander Weber, these were not isolated failures of discipline by individual guards, were they? This was policy. You implemented it. You refined it. You reported on it. Did you not?" And Weber, after a long silence, replied with the words that would define his testimony. "It was what was required of us to maintain order and extract compliance from a hostile population." There it was, stripped of euphemism and bureaucratic language, the admission that systematic harassment had been not aberration but policy, not failure but implementation of Reich strategy. The courtroom stirred. Journalists wrote furiously. Survivors wept or sat in stone-faced silence. The judges made notes. A confession of this type, this explicit, was relatively rare at Nuremberg, where defendants typically minimized their knowledge, claimed they were merely following orders, or denied the systematic nature of crimes. Weber's admission was devastating precisely because it came with explanation. He understood it was policy, he implemented it as policy, and he would have continued implementing it had the Reich endured. The epilogue to Weber's testimony came weeks later when the tribunal delivered its verdict. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, a sentence that struck many survivors and observers as grotesquely inadequate given the scope of suffering he had administered, but which reflected the complex calculus of post-war justice, where the sheer number of perpetrators made capital punishment for all impossible, where distinctions were drawn between those who designed genocide and those who implemented subsidiary cruelties, where the logistics of justice themselves became a form of triage. Weber served 15 years before release in 1961, part of a broader West German amnesty that prioritized reintegration of former Nazis deemed less culpable. He returned to Bavaria, worked in minor administrative positions under an assumed name, and died in 1978 without ever speaking publicly about the trial or his confession. His silence in the post-war period was itself a kind of testimony, an inability or unwillingness to engage with the moral dimensions of actions he still seemed to view primarily in administrative terms. But the confession itself, preserved in trial transcripts and historical records, endured as evidence and as warning. It documented the mechanism by which ordinary administrative competence could be yoked to extraordinary evil. It revealed how ideological certainty about human hierarchies could justify the systematic degradation of those deemed inferior. It showed how bureaucracy could transform cruelty into procedure, how paperwork could normalize horror, how the language of administration, required, maintain order, extract compliance, could disguise the reality of bodies violated and psyches shattered. The larger truth that Weber's confession illuminated was about the fragility of human dignity under totalitarian systems designed to destroy it. The women who survived his facility had endured not just physical deprivation and danger, which characterized all detention during wartime, but something more insidious, a calculated assault on their identity as human beings, a systematic effort to reduce them to objects defined solely by their vulnerability. That they survived with personhood intact, that many testified despite the trauma of reliving their experiences, that they bore witness so that history would record what had been done, represented a triumph of human resilience over ideological brutality. The confession also spoke to the question of how societies reckon with systematic abuse of power. The Nuremberg trials were imperfect instruments of justice. Some perpetrators escaped judgment, some victims never received acknowledgement, some sentences seemed inadequate to the crimes committed. But the trials established a principle that would resonate through subsequent decades, that systematic cruelty, even when codified as policy and implemented through bureaucratic channels, remained criminal. That following orders did not absolve moral responsibility. That administrative efficiency in the service of inhumanity was not a defense but an aggravating factor. In the decades since Weber's testimony, scholars have analyzed it as a case study in perpetrator psychology, in the bureaucratization of violence, in the gendered nature of occupation cruelty. His confession appears in histories of the Holocaust, studies of the SS, analyses of Nuremberg's legal legacy, and feminist examinations of how women's bodies become sites of conflict and control during warfare. The testimony has been translated into dozens of languages, excerpted in textbooks, cited in international law proceedings, addressing systematic sexual violence in subsequent conflicts from Bosnia to Rwanda. What remains most haunting about the confession is not its explicit descriptions of specific cruelties, disturbing though those are, but Weber's tone throughout, the clinical detachment, the bureaucratic framing, the inability or refusal to acknowledge the women he discussed as fully human. He could describe their suffering without inhabiting it empathetically, could recount their humiliation without recognizing it as humiliation in any morally significant sense. They remained, even in his confession, administrative problems he had addressed through applied technique. This cognitive and moral dissociation, this capacity to inflict suffering without psychological integration of its meaning, represented something more disturbing than simple sadism. Sadism at least acknowledges the suffering it inflicts. Weber's testimony suggested something colder, a systematic training of consciousness to view certain categories of human beings as existing outside the moral community, as objects upon which power could be exercised without ethical constraint. The ideology of racial hierarchy that the Reich promoted had achieved, in Weber and men like him, a kind of complete internalization. They did not struggle against conscience because conscience had been successfully trained not to recognize its proper objects. Yet the women who testified against him demonstrated the failure of that ideological project. Despite everything done to strip away their dignity and reduce them to bare survival, they had maintained the capacity for moral witness. They remembered. They travelled to Nuremberg despite trauma. They spoke in clear voices about specific incidents and systematic patterns. They refused the dehumanization that had been imposed upon them. In this, They embodied a truth about human dignity that no ideology could fully eradicate, that it persisted even in spaces designed to destroy it, that it reasserted itself even after sustained assault, that it demanded recognition even from tribunals and historical records that could never adequately compensate for what had been lost. The confession of Klaus Weber thus stands in historical memory not as the triumph of justice — the inadequacy of his sentence ensures that — but as documentation of a specific form of evil and as testament to its survivors. It reminds subsequent generations that systematic cruelty requires systematic infrastructure, that bureaucracy can serve barbarism as efficiently as it serves benign administration, and that the language of procedure and policy can disguise but not ultimately erase the reality of human suffering it inflicts. It warns that the division of populations into worthy and disposable, the ideological justification of hierarchy, and the bureaucratic efficiency of modern states can combine into machinery of degradation that operates with industrial systematization, and it testifies finally to the essential role of confession and documentation in historical reckoning. Weber's admission did not undo the suffering he administered, it did not restore what was taken from his victims, but it created an official record that could not be denied, a historical marker that said, this happened, it was systematic, it was intentional, and it was wrong. In a world where denial and historical revisionism remain persistent dangers, where the nature and scope of Nazi crimes continue to be minimized by apologists, that record remains vital. The confession, preserved in the Palace of Justice archives, stands as evidence against forgetting, against the passage of time, that softens edges and obscures details, against the human tendency to avert eyes from uncomfortable truths. On that cold January day in 1946, when Klaus Weber began to speak, he perhaps believed he was simply providing testimony to mitigate his sentence, cooperating with inevitable Allied justice to secure the best possible personal outcome. But what he actually created was something larger and more enduring, a window into the machinery of systematic cruelty, a case study in how ideological certainty enables monstrous implementation, and unwittingly, through the very precision of his bureaucratic recollections, a memorial to the women whose suffering he had so methodically administered, and who now, through trial testimony and historical record, could speak back across decades to remind us all of the cost when human dignity is treated as administratively disposable. The echo of that testimony still resonates, a reminder that civilization's thin membrane can tear, that human rights require constant defense, and that the capacity for systematic cruelty lies dormant in bureaucratic systems, awaiting only ideological permission to emerge. Weber's confession, in all its clinical horror, remains a warning written in the language of administrative efficiency about the necessity of moral consciousness, the importance of individual responsibility within hierarchical systems, and the essential truth that no procedure, no policy, no order from superior authority can make right. What conscience knows is fundamentally wrong.